thanks so much for having us on. And look, I've been waiting 20 years to do this. This has been a fantastic year, a year that I cannot remember in 20 years. It has been sensational. We've had breeding activity in this species that I haven't seen in a long, long time. So I don't think I've ever started a talk by such a positive note. Usually it's pretty gloom and doom when you get on and do these things, but it has been an absolutely outstanding year. I am going to try to present, if I can. I'm not overly versed with Zoom, but let's see how we go sharing the screen. And hopefully you're seeing a little belly of a Southern Toadlet if all's going well.
It's coming through clear. Yep.
Beautiful. For those that aren't familiar with the species of the Southern Toadlet, they're 1 to 2 centimetres in size, a couple of grams in weight, live 14 plus years that we know of, quite widespread through southern Victoria and into Tasmania and a little bit into South Australia, although they probably may no longer be present in South Australia. We've suspected for a long time they've been going through declines, perhaps due to chytrid fungus, but probably more appropriately due to changing climate conditions. The species has this life history where it gets into depressions in autumn and breeds without the need of water in little nests, in the hope that these depressions will flood with regular autumn-winter rains, and the tadpoles will develop into a depression with water that has no predators in it, and they'll get out before everything else gets going. Great strategy, except if your climate is changing and you are not, and that hasn't worked too well for them. We have been pretty lucky over the last few years. We've had a bit of interest from Nillumbik Landcare Group and also from Melbourne Water to do some fairly intensive survey work. Get this to go. Sorry, it's a little bit blurry. Back in 2018, Nillumbik Landcare commissioned some work on the Shire in terms of locations of where these animals still occur. There were 109 records in the atlas from 43 different locations, and those smudges up on the screen there kind of represent where we hit up on those locations. Turns out about half of them were in private property hands now, and half of them were jointly shared between Parks Vic, Melbourne Water and Nillumbik Council. 2018, if you remember, was a horrific autumn. Most of the reserves through there were dust bowls right into April. In fact, we didn't really get any substantial rain in 2018 until the last weeks of April. And this is normally the prime breeding time for this animal. And so its breeding season consisted of about 6 days when it was wet enough to breed and call, but still warm enough for that activity to occur. So it wasn't an overly fruitful year, but we did locate the species in 6 locations within Nillumbik. More broadly, these are the areas, the still remaining locations around Melbourne for most of them. And I say still remaining, Yang Ying up on the top there, we tried really hard this year to find them. They have been there, but that looks like that's a population that's now gone. The Corrandirk bushland next to Hillsville Sanctuary looks like that population has gone. Langwarrin Fauna Reserve looks like that population is gone, but we still have them at Churchill and Listerfield, a little population in Donvale, North Warrandyte, which I'll show you shortly, and probably our major populations around Sugarloaf and Happy Valley, and some very small numbers of animals in Long Gully, along Chinaman's Gully and Boomers Reserve with 1 individual. So that's about the smattering of the species around the Greater Melbourne area at the moment. More particularly around the last few years, we've been concentrating, it's probably pretty hard to read on this map, but those clusters in the centre there are survey sites around Sugarloaf and Happy Valley. The cluster down the bottom of the map there is in Churchill and Listerfield, and there is a cluster up the top there that is at Yang Ying. So we've really kind of focused our efforts in those areas. One, to try to get an idea of just how stable the populations are through there, and what sort of threatening processes have been occurring there. So North Warrandyte, now if you're familiar with Stony Creek, runs down through there, there is one gully that feeds into Stony Creek that still has reasonable habitat on it, and it's got good populations of southern toadlets calling right along the gully system there. It's pretty nondescript. It forms like typical gullies. It forms little pools. The unfortunate part for this gully is that it is fed, I think, from runoff from the major roads. And so when it rains heavy, we get a fair bit of water coming down through those gully systems. We had no recruitment. The gully was completely dry in 2018. 2019, it didn't fill for any length of time, but 2020, we had tadpoles. Unfortunately, during our later parts of our survey work, we weren't able to find metamorphs. I am hoping they developed and left the ponds before we got back to them. The other theory is, of course, they're all washed out with stormwater flows coming down from the gully, and that's a fair chance. Sugarloaf. So we tend to find most of the populations to the east of Sugarloaf in through here, and of course populations up through Happy Valley up to the north. And Frank has got one little southern toadlet down the bottom there that he's been monitoring now for a couple of years. Unfortunately, that southern toadlet didn't breed this year, or at least we couldn't locate any eggs or tadpoles. The gullies to the east where we are finding them are generally dry little ephemeral gullies like this. And again, in 2018, they were bone dry. In 2019, they didn't hold water for any length of time. Melbourne Water have put up some fencing around some of the breeding sites there, and they've been doing that to try to stop deer getting into the sites. Deer are a huge impact, massive impact through here. That little mud puddle to the left was actually a breeding depression this season, and 2 months later it looks like that. The deer numbers through there are out of control. Unfortunately, they share the same liking of the shallow depressions that the southern toadlets do. And of course, once the deer get into them, there isn't much habitat left. Fortunately, they didn't get in and destroy all the habitat through there, and we're able to get recruitment out in 2020. So we're able to get little metamorphs coming out through those shallow ponds. We're able to get on that gully, I think there was about 4 or 5 of the ponds actually recruited some southern toadlets out of it, which was sensational. Happy Valley, likewise, the creek in Happy Valley is ephemeral. It has flowed most of this year, but most of the breeding is onto the tributaries beside the creek and in some of these mining depressions, sinkholes. 2018, there was nothing. They didn't hold water at all. 2019, they didn't hold water, but 2020 they have. Parks Vic have put up some temporary fencing around these. And again, we're able to pull up lots of metamorphs out of some of these ponds. But the same deal in Happy Valley, we're noticing a lot of deer damage in the gullies, and we're also noticing a fair bit of damage from bike riders, mountain bike riders, I presume, going in and cutting through some of these breeding sites. And the last remaining cluster was through Bunjil Reserve and Boomers Reserve to the north there. These are fairly scattered, so we're talking only about 6 individuals through Chinaman's Gully, 1 depression in Long Gully, which had similar numbers of animals, and Boomers Reserve, which has got 1 male calling in it as we speak. So again, through Chinaman's Gully, through Bunjil Reserve, noticing a fair amount of erosion and deer damage coming into there. And in Long Gully, all the breeding is occurring into 1 single pond. So across the entire length of Long Gully, there are 6 individuals, probably a few less actually, probably only about 4 or 5 in this 1 depression. But fortunately, it filled, and we had breeding again this season. So while the species is fairly long-lived, I'd say this has probably been the first recruitment event we have had in 10 plus years for this species, which has been a remarkable thing to see, having worked with this animal for now, 20 plus years. The number of times I've been able to see recruitment out of depressions, I can still count on one hand. So this year has been a truly remarkable year for them. But threatening processes, we have identified chytrid fungus in the species this year for the first time ever. What role that plays, we're not too sure yet. But by far the biggest impact on this species would be deer. Deer have just destroyed the gully systems that these animals use. And until there is some sort of effective management of deer in these areas, then it's likely that these animals are not going to persist through that. And unfortunately, Parks Vic and Melbourne Waterland, it's often very difficult to eradicate deer on.